Why is the world trembling at the sight of this vast northern nation? The results of a top secret simulation conducted in the United States left even a Harvard professor speechless. Theoretically, these figures are impossible. It is a country that a Russian military expert declared to be more formidable than nuclear weapons. It is the nation that NATO urgently requested assistance from. This place was not traditionally known as a singular military superpower. It was none other than the place we live in, Canada. What exactly did they see in Canada that was shocking enough to turn the world upside down? It wasn't just about economic power. It wasn't just about advanced technology or natural resources. Hidden there was a colossal secret significant enough to rewrite textbooks around the globe. From now on, I will reveal all of that proud and shocking truth. Are you ready? A country that stands strong against the strong. The only nation acknowledged by a professor at Harvard University. Do you know which country is considered the most perfect example of civilized evolution? The reason for the world's astonishment? Professor William Leard of Harvard University made a declaration that turned the global academic community upside down. Crisis response speed 2.4 times faster. Learning efficiency 1.8 times higher. Execution structure consistency 99.7%. All these figures pointed to only one country. However, some people still shouted in denial. They scoffed, saying, "It's just an imitation, and there is no scientific evidence." At that moment, UNESCO headquarters directly refuted them. Canada is a unique nation that has evolved from independent technological adaptation into digital civilization. Now, the entire world asks in unison, is the direction humanity is currently heading truly aligned with that country? From now on, I will guide you to that amazing scene. We begin immediately with this shocking story that flew in from the United States. Please subscribe for more stories. The world's quietest giant. Does this phrase sound like a contradiction? I thought so too, but the moment I saw the sentence Professor William Leard wrote on the blackboard, everything changed. Canada is a nation that moves great powers not with force, but with speed and capability. The professor turned around and said, as of 2025, NATO is reaching out to Canada, not the United States. I stopped taking notes and stared at the screen. There, images of contracts showed European countries adopting Canadian equipment and technical support instead of American ones. Can you believe it? Hello, my name is Crystal. I'm majoring in international politics at Harvard University. It happened on March 12, 2025. If my friend Emily hadn't dragged me by the wrist, I would have been in the library writing my thesis. She insisted we go to Professor William Leard's special lecture, saying the topic was Canada and it would be interesting. Honestly, until then, I didn't expect much. When I thought of Canada, I only thought of maple syrup or cold winters. But the moment I entered the large lecture hall in the main building, something was different. Nearly 200 students had already filled the seats, and people were standing in the hallways. The lecture title written on the blackboard caught my eye, "The Nation Collapsing Conceptual Limits." Emily whispered that the title was too grandiose. I almost burst out laughing. Collapsing conceptual limits. Is such a thing possible for a single country? But the moment Professor William Leard stepped onto the podium, the entire lecture hall went silent. The professor looked to be in his late 60s, appearing gentle yet charismatic. He grabbed the microphone and spoke slowly. The story I will tell today is not just an analysis of a single country, but about how the world order is being reshaped. There was a resonance in his voice. The atmosphere in the lecture hall began to change. The professor pressed a remote control to display a photo on the screen. "This is a photo taken when I attended the International Security Forum in Brussels last month," he explained. In the photo, several scholars were sitting around a round table. I met a Russian defense expert there. We happened to drink coffee in the hallway and had an interesting conversation. The professor paused for a moment. The lecture hall became even quieter. He is a scholar famous for analyzing NATO and Western military power, having taught military strategy at a university in Moscow for over 30 years. The professor took a sip of water and said he asked the Russian professor how he viewed the current security situation in Europe. A moment of silence passed. Then the professor continued, saying the answer was unexpected. The screen changed and text appeared. The professor began to read exactly what the Russian professor had said. "William, you don't know Canada." Instantly, a murmur arose in the lecture hall. Emily poked my side, wondering why Canada was suddenly mentioned. The professor continued, "Honestly, I couldn't understand it at that moment. We were talking about European security, so why bring up Canada?" But the Russian professor was serious. The professor's tone lowered as he relayed that the experts said they were afraid of Canada. The lecture hall held its breath completely. You could hear a pin drop. When Professor Leard asked if it was because of weapons, he shook his head. When asked if it was economic power, he said that wasn't it either, and continued his explanation. The professor looked slowly around the lecture hall. When asked what the reason was, the Russian professor put down his coffee cup and answered like this: "It is because of execution, overwhelming execution. Execution." Small gasps leaked out from various corners of the lecture hall. I was confused for a moment. It was strange that Russia feared Canada, but for the reason to be execution, what on earth did that mean? The professor continued his explanation. The Russian professor evaluated that the United States is powerful but slow. Europe is integrated but complex, and China is vast but opaque. 3 flags appeared on the screen and then vanished. But he said Canada is different. He said once they decide, they execute immediately. If they promise, they deliver with miraculous speed, and they do not waver even when a crisis strikes. I tilted my head. I thought it might be an exaggeration. Can a country really be evaluated like that? Emily had a similar expression. However, the professor did not stop. He said that at the time he also argued that perhaps they were just being diligent. The professor smiled bitterly and relayed the Russian professor's reply. In international relations, speed and accuracy are the rarest assets. He added that this is especially true in emergency situations. The professor pressed the remote again. News related to world affairs appeared on the screen. With unstable situations continuing, nations are desperate, the professor explained. It is a matter of survival to see who can supply support or materials fastest, and most certainly. There was tension in his voice. "But what is the situation with the United States?" the professor asked. No student answered. According to recent reports, the delivery of support materials is being delayed from an initial 1 month to up to 18 months. 18 months. Sounds of surprise leaked from the lecture hall. The professor's words weighed heavily, stating that 18 months in the field is like an eternity. The professor walked slowly across the lecture hall and continued. But Canada reportedly delivered within an average of 6 months after the contract, and in some cases, less than 3 months. A graph appeared on the screen. It was data comparing the delivery periods of the United States and Canada. The difference was evident. The professor emphasized that this is exactly why the world is choosing Canada now. I opened my laptop and started searching urgently. Is it true? Early delivery of Canadian defense equipment to Europe, technical cooperation with Southeast Asia, dispatch of emergency relief teams during disasters. Indeed, the news was overflowing. It wasn't an exaggeration. Emily muttered quietly. "This is real." The professor returned to the front of the podium. He stared at the lecture hall, saying there was one last thing the Russian professor said. It became quiet again. Everyone was waiting for the next words. "William, there is no country in the Western world that shows such insane efficiency as Canada, and this is beyond the United States." It was shocking that a Russian scholar, and an expert at that, made such an evaluation. "But a question arises here," the professor said as he walked to the blackboard. He picked up a piece of chalk and drew a large question mark. Why Canada? Why was only Canada able to possess such overwhelming capability? After throwing the question, the professor looked around the lecture hall. He said it was interesting that it wasn't Germany nor Japan, but Canada. Drake, famous actors, Blackberry, or Bombardier. But now the professor was saying that the country is more trusted than the United States. I couldn't believe it, but curiosity surged at the same time. "What kind of country receives such an evaluation?" The professor spoke firmly. "This is no coincidence, and Canada's potential was not created overnight. There is a DNA that has spanned centuries." DNA. Does he mean that a nation has genes? The entire lecture hall was waiting for the professor's next words. There is one more thing the Russian professor said in Brussels. He said Canadians become stronger in the face of crisis and have the characteristic of making the impossible possible. He stated that this is the most threatening variable in international relations. The professor lifted the remote and changed the screen. Numbers poured out across the screen. Now, let's look at concrete evidence. The professor's voice echoed in the lecture hall. The first graph appeared. It was a comparison of manufacturing and shipbuilding delivery compliance rates by country. The blue bar graph was the United States and the red bar graph was Canada. The delay rate on the US side was noticeable. On the other hand, Canada's bar was surprisingly low, marked almost as no delay. A student raised his hand to ask a question. The professor pointed to that student. A student named Michael asked why other countries were so late. The professor thought for a moment and answered, "There are many reasons, but the biggest reason is the difference in system flexibility. Other countries are strong in manuals but weak in sudden situations or variables in the field. Approval procedures are complex, so the contract itself is often delayed. On the other hand, Canada has a system where the field management and related companies work closely together. This allows for perfect decision-making even within their culture of efficiency." A new graph appeared on the screen. This time, it was data from the specialized maritime industry and advanced technology sectors. Canada's trust does not only appear in general manufacturing. In the fields of icebreakers, specialized aircraft, and clean energy technology, Canada's skills are at an irreplaceable level. Emily reconfirmed the numbers she had written down in her notes. She looked like she couldn't believe it. The professor cited an interesting example. It was about the US government recently asking for Canada's help to revitalize its own specialized industries. It was an official announcement that Canadian companies would provide technical guidance and investment to American facilities. Photos of the interior of a high-tech shipyard and a clean energy lab appeared alternately on the screen. He explained that Canada has already perfectly established digital process systems. From design to manufacturing, everything is managed by artificial intelligence and digital twin technology, reducing errors and dramatically increasing speed. He said what surprised US government officials the most when they visited Canadian sites was the speed and level of digitalization. "We are still running around the field with paper blueprints, but Canada was controlling everything with a single tablet." The evaluation was that the technological gap had already widened by more than 10 years. The professor brought up another slide. This time it was an article from the European press. The title was intense. "Canada is becoming the world's new factory and savior." The professor began to read part of the article. "The greatest strength of Canadian companies is certainty. This does not simply mean performance or price. It is the ability to supply products of the promised quality, or better, on the promised date, regardless of political situations or budget conflicts." I was surprised that foreign media were analyzing Canada to this extent. The professor explained the reason. With global supply chains collapsing, the stable supply of Canadian parts and materials is a matter of survival, the professor emphasized, pointing at the screen. Pay attention to the key phrase here: immediate response. This is Canada's power. It means they not just talk, they actually move. He said one of the reasons a certain country ordered Canadian specialized vehicles or robotics was this speed. If they ordered products from other countries, they would have to wait several years. But Canadian products could be introduced within a year. The choice was obvious. Another graph appeared on the screen. It was the trend of Canada's industrial export growth over the last few years. It was drawing a sharp upward curve. Emily let out a small gasp. The professor added a meaningful remark. "This figure is not just a sales record. It is an indicator showing how much the world trusts Canada. Spending money to buy goods means entrusting one's infrastructure and betting on the future. They are making that choice with Canada." The professor brought up the last slide. It was the conclusion of the article. "The reason Canada is most threatening is not technology, but certainty." The sentence was displayed largely. The professor read it slowly. "Canada is a country that delivers trust, and trust is the most powerful weapon." The lecture hall was quiet, as if holding its breath. Everyone seemed to be chewing on that sentence. Delivering trust. Not selling goods, but selling trust. I couldn't believe it was expressed that way. At the same time, I got goosebumps. I wondered if it was really such a country. The professor put down the remote and spoke. All the numbers and examples we've seen so far point to one truth. Canada is no longer just a vast northern country, but a nation the world relies on. And that is by trust, not force. I saw students nodding here and there in the lecture hall. But the question remained, how on earth, how was this possible? Isn't Canada known more for its natural resources? My mind was confused. The evidence was sufficient, but the reason was still vague. And the professor seemed to know that. He was preparing to ask the next question. The professor walked slowly to the blackboard. He picked up a piece of chalk and began to write a single question in large letters. Why Canada? The letters were clearly engraved on the blackboard. The professor turned around and looked around the lecture hall. All the evidence seen so far speaks of one fact. It is clear that Canada is a trusted country. But we cannot stop here. Technology alone cannot explain it. Then why did the world choose Canada and not others? The professor's question settled heavily in the lecture hall. A hand went up from the back of the room. The professor pointed to that student. It was Sato, an international student from Japan. He was a student famous for always asking logical and sharp questions. Sato lifted his laptop and spoke. Professor, the data you showed is interesting, but there is one part you are overlooking. Canadian technology is actually heavily influenced by the US or Europe in the past, and isn't its economic stability a result of proximity to the US? The atmosphere in the lecture hall changed subtly. Sato displayed the data he had prepared on the screen. It was material regarding the history of industrial development. It suggested that the origins of Canadian technology lay in the West or neighborly influence. Graphs and photo data were attached. Emily whispered softly from the side. I wonder if that's true. I felt the atmosphere in the lecture hall shaking a little. Sato's argument was essentially that Canada's success was the result of absorbing advanced technology well, and it was difficult to see it as unique DNA. Sato's voice was full of confidence. I saw a few students nodding. It sounded like a valid point. The professor was listening quietly. There was no wavering in his expression, rather he was smiling gently. When Sato finished his presentation and sat down, the professor slowly opened his mouth. That is a very good point. He acknowledged it first. He said it was true that Canada had introduced technology in the past. But I want to ask one question here, the professor said as he began to write a new sentence on the blackboard. Technology transfer was received by many countries, but why did only Canada succeed in this specific way? The professor turned around and spoke in a normal tone. Many countries received technology from the West. But why aren't those countries leading the global market now? The professor's question echoed in the lecture hall. I saw Sato's face stiffen a little. The professor continued in a calm voice. Technology transfer is like giving a seed. But germinating that seed and making it into a vast forest is a completely different dimension of ability. The professor displayed new data on the screen. It was a timeline showing the development process of Canada's specialized industries. At first, it started with adaptation, but from the middle, it changed. Data appeared showing that Canadian engineers began to improve designs independently and later developed entirely new production methods. There was a particularly impressive part, the concept of the super gap, a strategy to create a gap that no one can cross, which became the standard for global specialized technology. The professor emphasized, this is not technology learned from others, but innovation that Canada developed independently. I saw Sato fidgeting with his laptop. He seemed to be looking for counter-argument data, but the professor did not stop. Let's look at the energy sector too. He brought up a new slide. Data appeared showing that after accepting technology, Canada improved it to be smarter and more sustainable. As a result, performance became better than the original products, and now, conversely, the world is buying Canadian components. It was an ironic event. The professor added a meaningful remark. Learning technology is imitation, but improving and developing it is creation. Canada didn't stop at using accepted technology, but created something better. This is exactly the difference from other countries. I saw Sato's hand trembling slightly. He seemed unable to find data to refute. The professor walked to the blackboard again. Now, I will return to the key question, he said, picking up the chalk. Are Canadians different from birth? He wrote the question, turned around, and answered. No, Canadians are human too, and they do not possess special genes. But Canada has DNA, the professor declared. I am explaining cultural DNA, not biological DNA. It is a way of thinking, time, and behavioral patterns formed over centuries. He said this is the source of the power to accept technology and create something better. The lecture hall entered focus mode again. Everyone was waiting for the professor's next words. The professor began to write in large letters on the blackboard. 3 types of DNA. He stopped his hand and looked slowly around the lecture hall. The first DNA is the DNA of perseverance, the second is the DNA of connection, and the third is the DNA of resilience. I started to wonder what that meant. The expression DNA sounded strange at first, but listening to the professor's explanation, I began to understand it gradually. It means the way culture is passed down is similar to genes. It is invisible, but certainly exists and continues across generations. Sato still had his head down. I heard the friend next to him asking if he was okay. Sato nodded slightly, but there was no strength in his voice. The shock of witnessing the collapse of the logic he presented seemed great. Emily wrote something in her notebook and whispered, "The concept of DNA is interesting." I thought that was certainly true. Technology can be learned, but the culture that utilizes it cannot be easily created. Canada's success was not because it received technology, but because there was cultural soil to use that technology correctly. The professor added one last word. From now on, we will examine those three DNAs one by one. First, the DNA of perseverance. The entire lecture hall held its breath and waited for what was next. Even Sato raised his head and started staring at the screen. I had a feeling I was about to learn something important. Until now, we saw the results, but from now on, it seemed to be a time to dig into the causes. Why Canada? I felt like I would hear the real answer to this question. 3 DNAs, the first story was about to begin. The professor picked up the remote and displayed a new slide. Images of an ancient, vast wilderness and the first transcontinental railway appeared on the screen. The professor spoke slowly. To explain the first DNA, the DNA of perseverance, we must go back in time. Hundreds of years. Text appeared on the screen. The Transcontinental Railway and survival in the North. The professor asked if we knew what significance these achievements hold in human history. The professor began his explanation. These are not just infrastructure projects, but symbols of innovation that defied the odds. Connecting a continent across impossible terrain and surviving in harsh climates meant they had an extraordinary tenacity and technical capability. The professor emphasized. Pay attention to this perseverance. The determination to complete the task despite countless failures. This is not easy, even with modern technology. The professor presented new material. It was a research paper on the structure of early ice-breaking vessels. These ships, charging through ice, were high-tech machines unimaginable at the time. The professor threw a meaningful question. What do you think this is similar to? The lecture hall was quiet. No one could answer. The professor spoke the answer. Modern specialized manufacturing and the defense industry. I got goosebumps instantly. 2 images appeared side by side on the screen. On the left was a ship breaking through rough ice, and on the right was a clean tech manufacturing process. The professor began to compare them one by one. The innovation of pioneering paths no one else has taken is similar to the supergap strategy in technology. And the overwhelming durability and defense resemble the competitiveness of Canadian specialized equipment sweeping the world today. It means they were pursuing world-class technology from centuries ago. Of course, the form was different, but the spirit of pursuing perfection was the same. The craftsmanship that does not allow errors started right here. I rested my chin on my hand and thought. I realized that the past and present connect like this. It was no accident that Canada's specialized industries are at a world-class level. The obsession with technology and the desire for the best, continued from the old days, were engraved like DNA. However, a more important question remains here, the professor said. Why did they have to create such innovative things? The professor began to explain with a serious expression. Canada possesses vast land but faces extreme climates and rugged terrain. You cannot survive by being ordinary, so they had to be ahead of others. Even if making a single item, making it superior to anywhere else was a survival strategy. New text appeared on the screen. If the environment is harsh, polish the technology. He said this spirit lies at the root of why modern Canadians obsess over technology and do not compromise on quality. This is not simple pride, but a survival instinct. The lecture hall became solemn. It was because this wasn't just a story about technology, but about a nation's survival strategy. I saw Sato writing something diligently in his note. The bewildered expression from earlier was gone, and he was taking notes seriously. The professor moved time to the present. Stories of Canada's aerospace or robotics industries came up again. He asked if we remembered the digital shipyard technology we saw earlier. The professor connected that the root of that innovation lies in this challenging spirit. Perseverance that makes the impossible possible. The challenging spirit strong enough to be called reckless, building industries where there was nothing. He explained that all of this is inheriting the DNA of their ancestors. There was a particularly impressive part. The professor introduced an interview with a Canadian engineer. We do not allow a delay of 0.1 seconds because we know that is competitiveness, and if we stop, we fall behind. It was a remark tinged with determination, the professor added. He said this is exactly the Canadian spirit. The sense of crisis and responsibility that if made poorly, people could be in danger. So they pursued perfection. The last slide on the screen turned over. A nation that gets stronger whenever a crisis comes. The professor began his explanation. Looking at Canada's history, they have used every crisis or hardship as an opportunity for a leap forward. From the challenges of early settlement to overcoming economic shifts, they surprised the world with their resilience. Why? The professor threw a question. The answer was simple. Because they knew that crisis is an opportunity for change, and to survive, one must evolve. My heart started racing. This was not a simple history lecture. It was a time dissecting the survival code of a nation. A huge flow starting from the wilderness leading to modern Canada's success began to appear. The professor grabbed the chalk again at the blackboard. DNA of perseverance, survival, turning crisis into opportunity. He summarized like this and looked around the lecture hall. This is exactly the reason Canada could become world-class in manufacturing and technology. The seeds planted by pioneers centuries ago are blooming now. I underlined it in my note and wrote it down. DNA of perseverance, DNA of survival. Now, I started to wonder about the second DNA. The professor drank a sip of water and took a breather. Students were buzzing in various places in the lecture hall. The professor walked to the blackboard again. He picked up the chalk and began to draw a large circle. Let's move on to the second DNA. There was strength in his voice. The DNA of connection. Innovation. He began to write a word inside the circle, connectivity. The professor smiled and spoke. Canada has a unique history of communication innovations. Pay attention to this spirit of connectivity. The professor began his explanation. In the past, information traveled slowly, but Canadians invented tools like the telephone to connect people across vast distances. What does this mean? The professor answered. The democratization of connection. Creating systems where anyone can share knowledge and information regardless of distance. A new slide was displayed on the screen. Information in everyone's hands. The professor explained. The reason Canada boasts a highly educated population and became a tech hub lies here. The scientific characteristic of their approach to infrastructure is optimized for the digital age. The speed of sharing and spreading information is unrivaled. The screen showed landscapes of modern Canada, people connecting through advanced networks, digital government systems, and global media, the professor said. Looking at Canada's systems, they are designed so that anyone can access them easily. This is also the spirit of connection, DNA that considers the user and pursues efficiency, Emily whispered in admiration. Science has become culture. That statement was correct. Processing complex technology to make it easy to use. That was the reason Canadian products are loved globally. From software to platforms, this DNA flows through everything. The professor summarized on the blackboard. Second DNA, science and sharing, connectivity. The power of not monopolizing knowledge but sharing it and streamlining systems. This made Canada a nation with some of the smartest citizens in the world. The professor put down the remote to take a brief rest. The students' enthusiasm did not cool down. The professor walked out again and began to write the last phrase on the blackboard. Third DNA, resilience. The professor turned around and explained. Canadians have DNA that does not stop but overcomes crises. Do you know about their response to the massive natural disasters? News footage appeared on the screen. Lines of people helping neighbors during floods and ice storms were visible, the professor explained. When communities faced devastation, citizens came out to help rebuild their country and neighbors. It was a scene rarely seen anywhere else in the world. Sounds of surprise burst out from the lecture hall. The professor continued. Canadians do not divide when a crisis strikes, they unite. And using that crisis as a stepping stone, they leap higher. From tough economic times to becoming a leader in global stability. This indomitable will is exactly the DNA of resilience. The professor drew 3 circles on the blackboard, and in the center where they overlapped, he wrote largely, trust. The perseverance of pioneers guarantees quality. The science of connection streamlines systems. And the will to overcome crises created a national character that keeps promises. The professor looked around the lecture hall. Where these 3 meet, the world's strongest trust was born. The power to keep promises not by force, quality that overwhelms others, and evolution that does not stop. Combined, these are why the world chooses Canada as a partner. The photo of Brussels appeared on the screen again. It was the end of the conversation with the Russian professor. There was a final remark the Russian professor made. William, Canada is not a country that suppresses the world with force. It is a country that moves the world with capability. And that is scarier than nuclear weapons. Force can be blocked, but charm and trust cannot be blocked. How can you stop people from voluntarily choosing Canada? The professor brought up the last slide, a single sentence on a blank screen. The invisible is the strongest. The professor read it down quietly. Tanks or missiles are visible, but trust, sincerity, responsibility, and passion. These invisible things are actually stronger than any weapon. What Canada possesses is exactly this power. A country where people are the resource. A country with a vast land and even wider influence. Outside the window, the sky of Boston was turning red. What I heard today might not have been just a story of a single country, but a hint about humanity's future. The possibility that the world can be changed not by force, but by trust. Not by confrontation, but by cooperation. Canada was proving that. Thank you for listening to my story until the end. How was today's story? The world changes rapidly, but the values of trust and sincerity do not change. When we trust someone, doesn't the world become a little stronger? Please leave your thoughts in the comments section below. And please share this touching story with people around you and talk about it together. What did you think of this article, eh? Let's check out what the folks are saying. As a Canadian engineer working in the Arctic sector, the DNA of perseverance part really hit home. We don't deal with the cold by complaining. We innovate to survive. The professor is right. We don't just build things. We build them to withstand the impossible. Proud to see our quiet, hard work finally making noise. C'est exactement ça. Ici au Québec, l'aérospatiale et l'énergie propre ne sont pas des blagues. On livre la qualité parce qu'on respecte la parole donnée. La confiance est plus forte que les armes. Quelle belle phrase pour décrire notre pays. Merci de montrer le vrai visage du Canada. The part about speed versus bureaucracy is so true. I work in logistics, and the difference between getting approval here versus south of the border is night and day. We might be polite, but when it's time to work, we don't mess around. Execution is our middle name. Cheers from BC. Finally, someone said it. We aren't just America's hat or a resource mine. We are the super gap creators. That story about the Russian expert fearing our efficiency gave me chills. It's not about being loud. It's about being effective. I was in that lecture hall in spirit. The concept of delivering trust is what Canadian diplomacy has always been about. In a world full of chaos, Canada offers certainty. That is our superpower. 100% execution consistency isn't a myth, it's our standard. Sato got schooled, but seriously, adaptation is innovation. We took technology and made it survive 40-degree Celsius winters. That requires a different level of genius. Proud to be part of the civilized evolution. Watching this brought a tear to my eye. Living here for 10 years, I've always felt that quiet strength of the Great White North. Just like the professor said, Canadians don't go around boasting. We just keep our heads down and get her done the best we can. So proud to be part of the red and white. Engineer down in Seattle here, and I can vouch for this. We hit a major supply chain snag last year, and the only folks who delivered on time, and even sent a specialist for free tech support, was a crew from Quebec. Their professionalism is truly next level. Chapeau! That line, strength comes from trust, not weapons, gave me goosebumps. The world is too obsessed with who has the bigger guns or longer range missiles, forgetting that trust is what keeps civilization running. Canada is teaching the world a lesson in growing up. I was just like Sato in the story at first, thinking Canada just got lucky with resources. But after coming here for school and seeing folks face the blizzards, shoveling out their neighbors' driveways without being asked, that's that resilient DNA the prof talked about. Coldest country, warmest hearts. The term silent giant hits the nail on the head. In both world wars, Canada punched above its weight, but rarely gets the credit in Hollywood movies. Now they're quietly saving global supply chains. It's about time the history books gave Canada its due. Never thought of Canada as a tech powerhouse until I saw this video. Trading military might for speed and precision is a huge step forward for humanity. I really hope my home country takes a page out of their book. Did you guys notice? When the world goes sideways, people don't look to the bullies for weapons. They look to the reliable ones for solutions. Canada is that rock. Thanks to the channel for this amazing perspective. Don't forget the kindness. That connection DNA isn't just tech, it's culture. If you wipe out on your bike in Canada, 5 people will stop to make sure you're okay. That's soft power that no nuke can ever beat. Finally, subscribing, liking, and setting notifications, which takes just 1 second, is a great help for video production. This was Collection of Emotions, conveying sincerity to you with emotion. Have a happy day today.